Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Monday, July 21st. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Does staying up to date with politics sometimes make you feel depressed? Turns out, you're not alone.
Depression leads us to withdraw from the political world and become less engaged, less attentive to the news, less informed.
Coming up, we will speak with a UC Merced professor who's written a book about the connection between politics and depression. That conversation in just a moment.
The White House has declared victory in President Trump's plan to defund public broadcasting. But while they can strip stations like KVPR of funding, they won't silence our service to Central California. We need the independent voice of public radio for moments just like this one. KVPR now faces an imminent shortfall of around $175,000. You can help ensure this service remains strong amid this new threat by starting a new monthly gift today at kvpr.org/donate. Thanks for your support.
And now to our feature story. No matter where you fall on the political spectrum, most people can agree that politics can be, well, depressing at times. Cuts to federally funded health care, increasing tariffs, and immigration raids. These are all big national stories that have real-life implications here in Central California. And if you feel like it's all a little too much, you are not alone. Christopher Ojeda is a political scientist at UC Merced. In recent years, he noticed that people were becoming increasingly weighed down by the state of politics and society. So, like any good scientist, he dug into the data and discussed his findings in his recently published book, The Sad Citizen: How Politics is Depressing and Why It Matters. It turns out a depressed society can lead to a detached electorate. So how can we make things better? I recently spoke with Christopher about The Sad Citizen, and he starts by explaining what inspired him to write about depression from a political perspective.
For a long time, I avoided writing about depression because I thought it was something that was written about by psychiatrists or psychologists or maybe even sociologists, but I thought it was outside the purview of political science. And then I was writing about it. I did decide to write about it in the context of the income participation gap, which is the idea that the rich participate more than the poor. And we know poverty is a huge risk factor for depression. So I thought, well, maybe this could help explain this gap. And so I started writing about depression as an input into politics. And then in 2016, I had a friend become depressed following the election of Trump. And I began to wonder, well, maybe politics can make us depressed. And then I still didn't write about it because I thought, well, this is really not my role as a political scientist. But the pandemic happened in 2020. And we saw the mental health of Americans and really people around the world decline significantly. And I thought, well, someone has to write about this. And that's when I decided to write this book.
Yeah, the book is titled The Sad Citizen: How Politics is Depressing and Why It Matters. When you were speaking, I immediately thought of the pandemic and sort of the post-pandemic effects that we've seen in students, children, and adults. You know, I do want to pivot a little bit to how you produce this book, because I'm sure it's not just anecdotal. We've all got stories about, sadness during or after the pandemic or because of politics. But what data did you use to sort of quantify that we are actually sadder as a society because of politics?
It's a great question. I mean, I started with the anecdote of my friend, but as a scientist, the question is this just a unique case, or is there something systematic going on here? And so I began with interviews of mental health professionals. I want to just hear stories about people who were feeling depressed about politics. What were mental health professionals hearing from their clients when they came in for therapy? And I heard a lot about personal relationships, an adolescent girl who was bullied at school for her political beliefs, couples who would bicker anytime the news came on. So I heard a lot of really interesting stories, but I wanted to take it a step further. And so I downloaded every poll I could find in the United States over the past 50 years or so that included a question about feeling disappointed or sad or depressed about politics. And what I found is that people reported these feelings in connection with a lot of different areas of politics. It could be elections, it could be the performance of officials, it could be the passage of public policies. And that's when I really began to see this effect come into shape.
Mm. I mean, you have this sentence in your book that I want to quote. You say, emotions are central to politics, but depression hasn't received much attention from either political actors or political scientists. So I'm curious if you could sort of elaborate on the dangers, if you will, of a depressed society. I would think that that would mean less engagement, which could be harmful to our political system.
Absolutely, you're right. That depression leads us to withdraw from the political world and become less engaged, less attentive to the news, less informed, less trusting of government, and so it really has this demobilizing effect. It hadn't been studied in political science like other emotions. Political scientists for years have been studying anger or enthusiasm or anxiety. These emotions are really loud. They're really visible. Like we see anger in the street. People go to the protest when they're angry. And depression, on the other hand, it's invisible. Unlike anger or anxiety or enthusiasm, which are really loud emotions, depression is quiet. It's something we do in private. I mean, even we don't even want our friends or our closest family members to see us sad. It's, we go to our bedroom, we close the door. And so it's easy to overlook in politics, but it's actually quite important because whereas anger and anxiety, enthusiasm can tell us who participates, depression can tell us who doesn't participate.
Sure. You mentioned how when we're feeling sort of galvanized to take a stand because of politics, maybe we go to a protest or something. That made me think of recent events, for instance, the Black Lives Matter protests. What other sort of recent examples from our current political reality did you sort of draw on to write this book?
One issue that jumped out to me was the issue of climate change. So late in the book, I do this little case study of climate change, and I find that a lot of political activists who are dealing with the issue of climate change face a lot of burnout. They're pouring all these resources, this time, this energy into enacting change. And what they're finding is that change is really hard to come by. And they experience this deep loss, this like sense of hopelessness. Are we ever going to get what we want? I've spent so much of my life working on this, and that can leave them feeling really, really depressed. So that was an issue that interested me and that I wrote about. Another one was Dobbs. I did an experiment in which I asked people to recall a negative political event that they had experienced recently. And I just incidentally had fielded the experiment right after the Dobbs decision had been passed down. And what I found is that a lot of people were talking about feeling depressed because of the losing the right to have an abortion. Mm-hmm. And that was another issue that really jumped out to me. And I ended up writing quite a bit about it, even though I hadn't anticipated writing about it until I was looking at the data I'd gotten, and it was just jumping off the page at me.
You say in your book, I'll quote you again, democracy should empower citizens rather than depress them. But much of your research shows that many people don't feel empowered because of many of the examples we've been talking about. You also mentioned a consequence could be that people are less attentive to the news. We certainly can relate to that as a news organization. News fatigue is a real thing, even when you work in the industry. So how would you recommend that people stay informed citizens, for those who care to be, without having politics or sort of the future of society weighing on them constantly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that staying informed and staying engaged in politics is a marathon, not a sprint. And so it is okay to take breaks if it's going to help you stay engaged in the long term. So I think sometimes people, myself included, I sometimes get overwhelmed with what I see in the news, and I just need to put my phone down or stop reading for a little bit or turn the TV off. And I have to remind myself that's okay, because I'll feel guilty about it. I always think, well, a responsible democratic citizen is informed. But sometimes I need those breaks in order to sort of maintain that responsibility over the long term. So I think it's okay to take breaks.
Yeah, the FOMO is real, but
Yeah.
you're right. There's always the next thing coming. I'm curious if you think there's anything that politicians could do to sort of improve political morale among their constituents. Is this something that falls on them too? Or is there anyone else that could help kind of make an impact and improve our outlook?
I think that getting engaged locally with organizations that align with your values is a great way to improve your morale. I think a lot of the depressing effects of politics is so much about us being focused on what's going on in Washington, D.C. And we have such little control over what happens in Washington, D.C. Yeah, we can vote every 4 years, but that's not really us making decisions. But at the local level, we can get engaged, we can build connection, we can make a difference. And I think that's empowering.
Christopher Ojeda, Associate Professor and Political Scientist at UC Merced. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And that is today's show. Do you enjoy listening to the podcast? Support Central Valley Daily by leaving a 5-star review in your podcast app. We really appreciate your support. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. You can find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
These days, there's so much news, it can be hard to keep up with what it all means for you, your family, and your community. The Consider This podcast from NPR features our award-winning journalism. 6 days a week, we bring you a deep dive on a news story and provide the context and analysis that helps you make sense of the news. We get behind the headlines. We get to the truth. Listen to the Consider This podcast from NPR.